Good morning. Very glad to have everyone here this morning as we continue in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. And we're in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 32. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 32. So, recalling that Matthew organizes his gospel by theme rather than by chronology, we want to be sure and keep in mind the context of where these passages appear, that since Matthew chapter 8, really, Matthew has been emphasizing Jesus's authority that he's shown over the natural world, authority over the spiritual world, authority to forgive sins, demonstrated by his teaching and his miracles of healing, and kind of bookended here in the casting out of the Gerasene demons in Matthew 8:32 and following. Here now in Matthew chapter 9, he is once again casting out demons. And this is, again, very common in Hebrew to have a similar thing at the beginning and the end. And here we read, just as they were going out, a demon-possessed man who was unable to speak was brought to him. When the demon had been driven out, the man who had been mute spoke, and the crowds were amazed, saying, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "He drives out demons by the ruler of demons." Now, Matthew 12, we're going to see this feature again, and we'll talk more about it then. But for now, it's important to note, what are the Pharisees conceding whenever they say that he drives out demons by the ruler of demons? What do they concede? That he is driving out demons. This is not to spoil the ending, but whenever they're offering an explanation for why Jesus's body cannot be found after the resurrection, they pay off the guards to say that they fell asleep and that his disciples came and took the body in the night while they were asleep. What do they concede when they offer that explanation, that justification? They can't find the body, right? And so whenever they say that this this extraordinary event happened by alternative means, they're acknowledging the event itself and are contending with how it is accomplished. But of course, Jesus's teaching and character rebuffs their accusation that he drives out demons by the ruler of demons. Now, as for whether or not there's any significance to the fact that this demon-possessed man is mute, there may be some correlation to the fact that this is following immediately after he has restored sight to a blind man. But it seems that the blindness of the man, beginning in verse 27, was by natural means, and that the muteness of the man, beginning in verse 32, was by supernatural means, by demon possession, rather than some genetic abnormality, some birth defect, or some accident after being born. But there is some correlation there, I suppose, of restoring sight and restoring the ability to speak. But it's demon possession that often captivates the mind and the imaginations of audiences. And what we find is that exorcism is nothing in the New Testament like what it is purported to be today, not just in Hollywood, but by those who actually contend that they are legitimately casting out demons. Whenever a demon is cast out, how much effort does it require on the part of Jesus? None, right? So even if you go back to Matthew chapter 8, the longer passage beginning in Matthew 8:28, you'll notice that there's only one red word in this entire passage, beginning in verse 28 and ending in verse 34. What is that one word? Go, right? And so, is it by power that Jesus casts out demons? Now, let me try and illustrate the difference here. If my son decides that he's going to go, I don't know, into some room that I've said he's not allowed to go to, and he keeps walking, he ignores my instruction, and I grab him and pull him back, was he prevented from entering that room by power or by authority? By power, right? But then if he decides he's going to go in that room and I say, Noah, sit down, and he sits down without me moving at all, laying a finger on him, was he prevented from entering the room by power or by authority? By authority, right? So whenever Jesus drives out demons of these demon-possessed individuals, it is by authority and not by power. Now, what's noteworthy about demon possession in the scriptures is that 90% of all demon possessions are recorded in the Gospels. There are just a few examples in the book of Acts, and despite the references to the miraculous gifts that people are able to perform throughout the rest of the epistles, never once is any reference made to the casting out of demons or unclean spirits or anything like that. So that communicates to me something implicit. That is that the existence of demon possession was limited to a very specific time for a very specific purpose, and that was explicitly to show the authority of Jesus. Noting even that whenever the demons are cast out in the book of Acts, does anyone recall what the 7 sons of Sceva say whenever they try and cast a demon out of a man? I adjure you, what? By Christ whom Paul preaches, to come out of that man. So even in a forgery, if you will, they're trying to use Jesus's authority. Now, the big contrast here is that whenever people profess demon possession today, the resultant exorcisms are usually bouts over days or weeks, sometimes claiming lives, a great exertion of effort. There's a whole book on, having to ascertain the name of the demon and the correct language and words to use in order to cast it out. And we find none of that in the New Testament. All right. Any questions, comments, anything anyone has? All right. So I did make reference at the end of the lesson last week about the book of Tobit, wherein a girl is demon possessed and is driven out using some very pagan-esque rituals. So whenever we read about the Jewish exorcists, this arises from this same kind of tradition. So whenever Jesus comes and isn't having to use fish eggs and the like to drive out demons, and is able at a word to rebuke them and cast them out of an individual, The Jews who are upholding their own false system have to dispute what Jesus is doing, and they choose the tactic here that he drives out demons by the ruler of demons here in chapter 9 and verse 34. Okay, so in verse 35, we read, Jesus continued going around all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dejected, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. So this is, I think, one of those times we have an unfortunate chapter-verse division, because the verses 35 through 38 here are leading directly into chapter 10 and verse 1. Remember, of course, that the chapter-verse divisions are not original to the authorship of the New Testament. They were added more than 1,000 years later. And that doesn't mean that chapter-verse divisions are bad. They're useful, they're practical, they're expedient, but we want to remember that they are not inspired. They're useful because I can say, go to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 1, and we all have an objective system to be able to follow that together. But remember that a chapter division does not mean that two passages are unrelated, as we might often think is the case. So here, Jesus, we're getting a brief overview of Jesus's preaching and ministry at this time, and he teaches in the synagogues, is proclaiming the gospel, the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. One thing we notice about Jesus in his ministry is that he never turns anyone away. The Syrophoenician widow is the one possible exception where he initially refuses her request, but it is my belief that his resistance was to her benefit and the benefit of the observers, and that it was never his intention to refuse her request. And we see here what the motivation for that is. When he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd. Now, I felt like it had been quiet this whole time. The thing was on, but it was muted. That makes a lot more sense. I was like, did the volume get turned down or something? Anyways, back to the point at hand. So he is motivated by compassion, but that does not mean that the purpose of miracles was to do good. Now, what I mean by that is miracles were used to accomplish good, but are there any examples where miracles were used to accomplish bad, not moral evil, but negative miracles as well? Ananias and Sapphira, right? There's divine intervention where Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead miraculously. We have a man being struck blind in the book of Acts. And of course, we learn from our time in the nursery about the 10 plagues of Egypt, which were all very negative. But each of those negative miracles had the same function and purpose as the positive miracles as well, which we also read here in Matthew chapter 9. At the beginning of Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus heals the paralytic man. So, to keep in mind the order in which these events occur, The friends of the paralytic man lower him through the roof on the stretcher. Jesus sees him and says in verse 2, "Have courage, son, your sins are forgiven." At this, some of the scribes said to themselves, "He's blaspheming." Perceiving their thoughts, Jesus said, "Why are you thinking evil thoughts in your hearts? For which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "Get up, take your stretcher, and go home." So he makes the invisible claim first, "Your sins are forgiven," and he makes the visible claim second. You can claim and say anything, but what you're able to prove is very different. And was there any way for Jesus to prove or for someone else to contend that that paralytic man's sins were forgiven whenever Jesus says in verse 3, "Your sins are forgiven"? No, it's an entirely invisible claim. There's no test that can be performed. There's no observation to be made. But to back that up, then, he gives the visible claim, telling this paralytic man to get up, pick up your bed, and go home. So the visible claim came second, the invisible claim came first. And this is the point of all miracles, to give proof to the message that someone is speaking. Now, that's the purpose of miracles, but still, Jesus is motivated by compassion. So we see the unity here between his person, purpose, and ministry. He was a compassionate person. His ministry was to preach the good news of the kingdom, and his purpose was to seek and save the lost. And in that, we see all of these coming together. Now, he observes the people that they are distressed and dejected